I'm very happy to welcome you to the... Okay. I'm very happy to welcome, welcome you to the second day of this Default conference. Thank you to you all, all the participants of yesterday. It was really a great day. I think that everybody has enjoyed it. I did. And so I hope that you really have a nice experiment with these ideas going through all the different performance and participations, talk, posters, and so on. So thank you, all of you who come today again, or past today. Yes, I wanted to know if some of you had succeeded to do the fold with the unusual ink drawing. Yes, I've... Wow! So, Caroline Coffin is the winner, I guess.
So who is the first?
I'm
sure.
So I'm very happy to begin the session today with two philosophical papers. The first one is Samo Tomšič talk. Samo Tomšič obtained his PhD in philosophy from the University of Ljubljana in Slovenia. He works as researcher in the interdisciplinary laboratory Image Knowledge Gestaltung at the Humboldt University in Berlin, Germany. His research area comprises psychoanalysis, epistemology, and French philosophy. In addition, he translated works by Kant, Freud, Foucault, and Lacan into Slovenian. Recent publications include The Capitalist Unconscious, Verso, as well as co-edited volumes Jacques Lacan between psychoanalysis and politics. And with Michael Friedman, psychoanalytic topological perspectives. But let us listen to his talk at the interface between Deleuze and Lacan.
Thank you. Thank you very much for this presentation and to the organizers for inviting me to present in the framework of this conference. So basically, I chose this image as a sort of guideline for the entire talk, and let me say at the very beginning, this is language, or basically this is what language does to its subject. This will be the topic, or this is at least how Lacan interprets the sculpture of the meaning, but I will get to this at a certain point more quickly. Am I screaming loud enough, or should I do more volume?
You should be ready.
Okay, so I would like to pinpoint some intersections between Lacan and Deleuze, which evolve around their critique of linguistics, targeting notably the persistence of what one might call the Aristotelian philosophy of language. These critical perspectives will be linked to their shared efforts, I believe, to construct a materialist science of language on the background of a topological lesson adopted from Baroque. And basically this is a sort of part of my broader engagement with structuralism, for which I think that we haven't really done with it or left it behind. So in 1,000 Plateaus, Deleuze and Guattari attack what they call the postulates of linguistics, which go as follows, and I simply adopt the quotations from the book. First, language is informational and communicational. Second, there is an abstract machine of language that does not appeal to any extrinsic factor. Third, there are constants or universals of language that permit us to define it as a homogeneous system. Fourth, language can be scientifically studied only under the conditions of a standard or major language, unquote. So there is nothing of these four postulates in this image if we interpret it as language. And basically, if I just put my cards on the table, the fold that I'm talking about throughout the paper, even though I'll get to the concept of the fold in the second half is basically language. So the thread of this critique can hardly be overlooked. Linguistics brings about a normalization and domestication of language by means of discourse of domination. Instead of bringing about an emancipation of language, if I may say so, something that Deleuze and Guattari appreciated in literature, this counterpart of linguistics, structural linguistics is said to have renewed the servitude of language. So linguistic structuralism would be something like a scientific taming of language. By prioritizing information and communication, linguistics remained in Aristotelian frames. It treated language as organon, instrument and organ, serving pragmatic purposes such as transmission of univocal meaning, adequate representation of reality, constitution of stable social relations. We all know this from schoolbook philosophies. Thereby, language remained centered by an ideal and normative communicational model. This is one crucial aspect of Deleuze and Guattari's notion of abstract machine. The other one being that language is envisaged in its absolute detachment from other registers of reality, be it human or inhuman. Once transformed into a scientific object, extracted and isolated from its concrete manifestations, recall that for Saussure, linguistics is grounded on the differentiation of language from speech. Language is turned into an ideality that, as such, does not exist. So the object of linguistics, one could say, is inexistent, but it nevertheless serves well for regulating the practice and the experience of language. Constructing constants and the universals, supposedly common to all languages, enables the isolation of the scientific object. This isolation is inevitably accompanied by the homogenization of language. So language is cleaned of surpluses, deviations, movements that accompany concrete speech situations. Deleuze and Guattari's last point, the study of language under the paradigm of a major or standard language, most explicitly questions the ideological neutrality of linguistic treatment of language. The expression major language indicates the persistence of a power relation in the science of language and should be correlated to the idea of a minor language, which can, within an abstract linguistic regime, only appear as a dialect actualization of the universal features of language, or an impossibility to live on the level of the constructed standards. So it can only fade. For the science of language, living language is ontologically subordinated to language as such, the scientific object that linguistics supposedly extracts from the Babylon of natural languages. And we can hardly avoid evoking Deleuze's controversial statement from Abécédaire that linguistics has caused a lot of harm, damage, evil. Linguistics is thus depicted as a negative science which should be contrasted to the lessons of literature, as already mentioned, where minor language is practiced beyond the abstract linguistic machine and against the fantasy of the universal and normative grammar. Literature, one could say, is a critique of linguistics and a clinics of language. So no surprise that Deleuze closes his film interview, the Abécédaire, with hostile remarks on Wittgenstein and analytic philosophers who are accused of assassination of philosophy. They constructed a system of terror, this is also what Deleuze says, and it elevated their poor reasoning into greatness. Pauvreté installée en grandeur, says Deleuze. So Deleuze remarkably avoids linguistics also in his response to the letter L, which evidently praises literature as a specific experience of the life of language, its becoming, metamorphosis, and autonomy. On the opposite side stands, of course, the structuralist obsession with mathematical formalization, which should make of linguistics a positive science whose object, la langue, is obtained through an act of subtraction, as Deleuze said in, Saussure said in his book, De la musique générale, la langue is le langage minus la parole, so language minus speech. The linguistic object is numb, and linguistic treats language as if no living being would speak it, as no body's language, as language without a body. So could we not see here another critical moment of Deleuze's famous concept of body without organs, linked to the linguistic problematics, such as such a body would stand for a language which is not an organon, so not an organ, but remains a body. And a materialist science of language, or what one might imagine under this description, and what I would argue structuralism did in the last instance strive to become, would thus need to think language beyond the four postulates of linguistics and beyond the shadow of Aristotelianism. For Deleuze, language is essentially, as he puts it in, as well in Abécédaire, a systematic disequilibrium, hence a non-relation which problematizes its presumed homogeneity and ideality without rejecting the idea of the system, as Jean-Jacques Le Cercle has already underlined. Or, the question is whether structuralism can be entirely subsumed to the normalizing tendency in the science of language. In an enthusiastic earlier text on structuralism, Deleuze had the correct intuition that structure can also be thought from the perspective of what one might describe as non-teleological becoming, from the viewpoint of its immanent instability. And I would argue that Lacan is precisely the structuralist who thought this instability the furthest. So the major flaw of linguistic structuralism as it developed lies in the fact that it perpetuated the ontological hierarchization of language and speech. Deleuze's condemnation of linguistics should therefore be additionally specified. What did a lot of harm is not linguistics per se, but grammar, which forecloses the immanent instability that it could reveal in language, at least a suspension of grammatical regularity and communicative teleology. Moreover, this instability could reveal the autonomy of language anchored precisely in its life, rather than in its abstract law. Incidentally, Lacan denounced the same restriction of linguistics when he openly thematized the insufficiencies of the media image of structuralism, which watered down the dialectical and materialist core of the structuralist research program. Quote Lacan, structuralism will last for as long as the roses, symbolisms, and Parnassus, one literary season. The structure, however, will not go away anytime soon, because it is inscribed into the real, unquote. So the structural realism expressed in the formulation, the inscription of the structure, of the linguistic structure, into the real, affirms a rational character of the real without concluding that the notion of structure should be thought exclusively through the linguistic paradigm. The point here is affirming that there is something like a real of language which can become the object of a science of structures that found its first and thus far most accomplished exemplification in structural linguistics and its extension into other disciplines, and also in the end into a rigorous epistemological model like Poiret's or Canguilhem's in the end. The end of structuralism as an opinion movement, as Jean-Claude Ménard called it, does not imply the end of structuralism and as a movement of episteme or as a scientific program, which was from the very beginning interdisciplinary anchor. So Lacan and Deleuze share a common denominator. There is a real of language which is irreducible to grammatical structuration or better grammatical regulation, and which is in turn symbolizable without being reducible to abstract quantification. The question remains, can the structural instability, linguistic non-relation, or systemic disequilibrium that unveils the real of language be more than an experience of literature? Can it become a scientific object? A positive answer to this question conditions the possibility for a materialist science of language. And in order to come closer to Deleuze, one could say the structure of the real manifests as becoming, and the features of this becoming structure, or this structure as becoming, is grasped with topology rather than with linguistics. The same holds for the linguistic notion of structure, which is precisely the Lacanian perspective. another representative quote from Lacan. Topology is not made to guide us in structure. Topology is this structure, as retroaction of the chain order of which language consists, unquote. One could remark something similar for reason, which is Deleuze and Guattari's attempt not simply to reject the concept of structure, but to name a linguistic disequilibrium which has nothing in common with the transcendentalism of structure promoted by the popularized media image of structuralism. Lacan and Deleuze thus share a common displacement not against structuralism but within structuralism, expressed by the effort to think the structural paradoxes by means of topological models, torsion in Lacan, fold in Deleuze. These tools enable to think structure as a peculiar disjunctive synthesis of instability and system. This is where, for both contexts, the topological lessons of Baroque become crucial. For the Baroque reference has been associated with Lacan's impenetrable and equivocal style from very early on. This feature seems to bring him furthest from the structuralist formalism which has been practiced by basically all major figures, including himself. The Baroque style plays with a breakdown of the presupposed linguistic equilibrium. In this respect, style raises the same structural problems as speech. In the light of Lacan's remark that his axiom, the unconscious is structured as a language that does not belong to the field of linguistics, style obtains an additional way as far as it seems to direct psychoanalysis from science to literature, and one could actually raise the question of scientific styles within this very same context. Freud acknowledged this tendency in psychoanalysis from very early on when complaining that his case studies read more as novels rather than as scientific treatises. There is something deeply Baroque in the unconscious as such. In the end, the psychoanalytic and the linguistic objects seem to address two different aspects of the real of language and consequently two different concepts of structure. To paraphrase Poiret, the concept of structure initiated the passage from the closed world of the Aristotelian linguistics into the infinite universe of what could be a potential materialist science of language. Now, let us return at this point to Deleuze's favorable discussion of structuralism, for there we can find the best possible accentuation of its materialist potentials. The first criterion of structuralism is the differentiation between the symbolic, the imaginary, and the real, and the isolation of the epistemic object, which is the autonomy of the symbolic. As Deleuze writes, quote, "The symbolic must be understood as the production of the original and specific theoretical object," unquote, meaning that it distinguishes the science of language from other sciences while also placing it within the same epistemic paradigm as physics, biology, psychoanalysis, etc. Deleuze also detected well the specificities of this autonomous symbolic order. On the one hand, its topological features, and on the other hand, its internal multiplicity. Another quote, "Space is what is structural, but an unextended, pre-extensive space. The scientific ambition of structuralism is not quantitative, but topological and relational," unquote, and further, quote, "Every structure is a multiplicity," unquote. The notion of structure is equated with, quote, "a transcendental topology, which," quote, "is real without being actual and ideal without being abstract," unquote. So there is a very peculiar position that Deleuze is aiming at, and I think it has been discussed also in some of yesterday's talks. This is precisely the materialist quarrel. How to think real effects beyond the dualism of potentiality and actuality, and how to think an idea beyond the metaphysical dualism of abstract and concrete. And it is also clear that the rejection of another major feature of Aristotelianism is at stake here, an aspect that concerns the ontological status of mathematical, geometrical, and topological objects. For Aristotle, these objects are mere realities, which have hardly anything in common with the empirical objects of science. They are, in the best case, potentialities which nevertheless lack every actualization. For scientific modernity, however, mathematics becomes the privileged tool for explaining the real beyond the restrictive frameworks of human condition and cognition and consciousness. Mathematics and topology, one could say, become two materialist weapons against the prevalence of Aristotelian epistemological model, which has basically guided modern science up to Galileo. To the autonomy of the symbolic professed by structuralism, a specific subjectivity should be correlated, which became visible only once the modern scientific paradigm erased the figure of man, and before that the figure of the soul. As Foucault famously put it, quote, "It is no longer possible to think in our day than in the void left by man's disappearance. For this void does not create a deficiency, it does not constitute a lacuna that must be filled. It is nothing more and nothing less than the unfolding of a space in which it is once more possible to think," unquote. Basically, the fold is here named as a specific topology of the space of thinking. The abolition of man, which entails the abolition of the primacy of consciousness, indicates that an emancipation of science and a decentralization of knowledge took place. So they are no longer referred back to some presupposed transcendental subject, consciousness, and so on. They are no longer correlated to the figure of a neutral human observer or a transcendental subject of cognition, which imply a centralized topology of thinking and of language. The subject that can finally be grasped in the void, unveiled by the rejection of man from the scientific knowledge, appears as a fold in space. Now, how to approach this fold? It is not a simple rupture, but a discontinuous continuity, a disturbance, or even a torsion. It breaks the space without making a crack in it. Curiously, before his critique of linguistics, Deleuze saw in structuralism a science grounded on a rigorous theory of the subject, a non-psychological, non-individual, and non-anthropomorphic subject, or in Lacanian terms, a subject of the unconscious. Quote, "Structuralism is not at all a form of thought that suppresses the subject, but one that breaks it up and distributes it systematically, that contests the identity of the subject, that dissipates it and makes it shift from place to place, an always nomadic subject made of individuations but impersonal ones, or of singularities but pre-individual ones," unquote. So you see how basically the subject gets more and more inhuman, and basically a construction. So Baroque points in the same direction. Lacan, for instance, recurs to Baroque through another major rejection of pre-modern ontologies such as Aristotle. Quote, "The unconscious is not the fact that being thinks. The unconscious is the fact that being, by speaking, enjoys and wants to know nothing more," unquote. So being here is equivocal. It can be the question of being, qua being, but it can also be being as a, for example, human being. So what is countered is the old philosophical equation of thinking with being, to which Lacan opposes the notion of the unconscious, which is precisely a case of thinking which is not identical with itself, not to speak identical with being. He also invokes this second crucial problem of psychoanalysis, namely sexuality, which most openly manifests in the image of a body tormented by enjoyment. So Bernini's sculpture of Saint Teresa, a Baroque masterpiece in the Rome church Santa Maria della Vittoria, exemplifies the philosophical and epistemological lessons Lacan intended to draw from the psychoanalytic preoccupation with enjoyment and the unconscious. The critical value of Baroque is that it points out something that, according to Lacan, concerns the very essence of Christianity, in a way, an unintended scandal that only a true materialist can appreciate, and that concerns the resurrection not of the soul, but of the flesh. While for Aristotle, man thinks with his soul, for Christianity, one could argue, man thinks with his body, but in a very turbulent way. As the image also kind of tries to point out. So Baroque art most openly displays the materiality of thought, but also the materiality of what always goes hand in hand with thought, so materiality of enjoyment. which is for Freud and Lacan most intimately intertwined with symbolization, hence with language. Another crucial value of Baroque concerns the break with the representational art, a move that has become radicalized in modernist art such as suprematism, for instance. But Lacan interprets Bernini's sculpture, which could be still classified as representational, but Lacan argues that it's not, as the signifier, this minimal unit of language, which is the angel. Let us recall that angels are considered to be messengers, carriers of information and meaning. So the signifier invading, penetrating, so to speak, the body of Saint Teresa, the arrow, thereby causing a disturbance in the body which others, but Lacan among others, described as enjoyment, which has precisely nothing to do with communication. So you can see how the postulates of linguistics are basically decomposing. The question of adequate representation is replaced by the problem of linguistic production or causality of the signifier. So the real of language, in this case, from the psychoanalytic perspective, it would be enjoyment, brought about by the signifier in the speaking body, is visualized through an exaggeration, but what gets represented is precisely inadequacy, imbalance, disturbance, non-relation, which not only traverses language and characterizes the linguistic structure, but which basically is language and is linguistic structure. That is why it makes sense to claim, as Lacan does, quote, those representations, so these statues, are themselves martyrs. You know that martyr means witness of a more or less pure suffering. That was what our painting was about until the slate was wiped clean when people began to seriously concern themselves with little squares, unquote. So not images of torture, but in a way tortured images. And the same point can be extended to literature. Style does not stand for language of torture, but, so to speak, tortured language. And Baroque would then indeed lead to an encounter with structuralism, since it no less approaches structure from the viewpoint of instability and breakdown, and it is precisely here that the structure is, at least for certain structuralists, most real. Jacobson, for instance, argued that we have to understand language not from the viewpoint of normal functioning, but from its extremes, like child language and aphasia, the composition and the decomposition of language. So I'm approaching the end. I see land. The expression Baroque originates from the Italian Barocco, used by scholastic philosophers for describing an obstacle in propositional logic. The first point would address a linguistic hinderness or irregularity, a particularly complex and sophisticated syllogism. In the later periods, the meaning of Baroque was extended to designate, and I'm resuming from Encyclopedia Britannica and trying to pull out some lessons for our debate. So, in the later periods, the meaning of Baroque was extended to designate any contorted idea or involuted process of thought, which remains in line with linguistic deviation. Hence, we have an association of language and the unconscious, which produces sophisticated syllogisms through operations of condensation and displacement, as Freud argued, and which translate into linguistic operations of metaphor and metonymy, as already Jacobson before Lacan proposed. So another potential etymological source is the Portuguese Barroco, used to describe an irregular or imperfectly shaped pearl. This second meaning adds another feature, the incorrect or deformed shape, the opposite of the ancient idea of the sphere, which played a significant role in cosmology and pre-modern astronomy. Deleuze pointed out precisely this epistemic dimension in relation to the fold in Baroque sculpture and architecture, to quote Deleuze. What is Baroque in this distinction and division into two levels of floors? The distinction of two worlds is common to Platonic tradition. The world was thought to have an infinite number of floors, with a stairway that descends and ascends, with each step being lost in the upper order of the one and disintegrated in the ocean of the multiple. The universe as a stairwell makes the Neoplatonic tradition, but the Baroque contribution par excellence is a world with only two floors separated by a fold that echoes itself, arching from the two sides according to a different order. It expresses, as we shall see, the transformation of the cosmos into a mundus, unquote. So the deformed shape, the distortion of presumably perfect forms, and the possibility of a topology and geometry which is no longer rooted in the divide between the inside and the outside, between empty space and full space. This is what accompanies the replacement of the old cosmos, the closed world, with the modern mundus, the infinite universe. The two features of Baroque would thus be irregularity and decentralization, to which a third should be added, and that is precisely exaggeration. Still, according to the etymological analysis, the word Baroque subsequently began to describe, quote, anything irregular, bizarre, or otherwise departing from established rules and proportions, unquote. The overblown and over-decorated bodies and buildings which seem to leave no place for the void. This is where the unconscious subject enters the picture, a subject which materializes in the mentioned distortions and deformations. Quote, Deleuze again. Intentionality is still generated in a Euclidean space that prevents it from understanding itself and must be surpassed by another topological space which establishes contact between the outside and the inside, the most distant and the most deep. So basically, to conclude with this remark, the great merit of psychoanalysis remains that it detached the subject both from the metaphysical soul, which was eventually represented as a sphere, and the intentional consciousness, which is still a mode of thought that kind of emanates from a central point. The Freudian unconscious resides entirely in this ungraspable, undetectable, interrupted line, precisely a fold, which both links and delimits the inside and the outside, the subject and the other, matter and immaterial. Lacan's return to Freud thus strives to show that Freud's initial works contain an anticipation of structuralism. In Saussure too, we find the figure of the fold, which is nothing other than the famous bar placed between the signifier and the signifier. It delimits both elements without introducing a radical rupture. And in a way, I'm just going to skip the rest. One could say that this is where modern structuralism connects with the old Heraclitean claim, or the double character of Heraclitus. On the one hand, the pantarei, everything flows, but on the other side also logos rules. So basically, these are two aspects, not only the relativism of flows, but also an immanence of self-unfolding logos in this precise flow. So basically, two sides of structure that need to be constantly with an effort of thought fused together rather than thought in a dichotomy. So thank you very much, and I apologize for this torture.
Thank you very much for this very clear and structured.
Yeah, without the flow.
So, you want to ask a question?
Yes, I have a question. Sometimes terms are used that do not have the same meaning in physics, for example, in philosophy. So you used a lot. You used a lot the term of topology since the beginning of your talk.
Yeah.
In fact, I did not get what it means for you as a philosopher.
Well, in philosophy, and also the way Deleuze and Lacan are using it, they try to be faithful to, let's say, topology as a branch of mathematics, and at the same time they interpret the consequences of let's say, a construction of space that has, strictly speaking, no center, and that, from the viewpoint of an uninitiated observer, basically is composed of spatial paradoxes, which are rational, which are completely mathematized, but which at the same time, again, to an uninitiated observer, in an uninitiated observer, in a way, pose a certain resist to thought, resist to be thought. So at least certain thinkers from humanities tend to, in a way, fetishize natural sciences or positive sciences precisely at the points where, in a way, they propose tools that challenge, that in a way antagonize the anchoring of thought in, like habitual, everyday experience or some sort of superficial observation of phenomena. I mean, in a way, one could say this is what science has been, according to certain epistemologies, since the early modernity. So it's no longer describing phenomena; it's basically constructing its objects, which are in a way violating the regime of perceptible.
So it does not have any link with studying the links and the neighbors.
It does. I mean, it does. But once you export, for instance, the reference to topology into humanities, in a way, you create a bastard child. This is very clear. Just like you could create a bastard child if you would import into natural sciences something like, something from humanities. I can mention one bastard child, the atheism what's the guy's name again? The selfish gene guy. Yeah, exactly. I mean, this is utter vulgarism. This is not atheism. This is vulgar. So it's, again, you see, it's not exactly the same object or comparable example, but what is produced is some sort of very clumsy, spontaneous philosophy which needs to be seriously challenged and criticized. Even though, spontaneously, I would agree with his atheism, but he's practicing it out of completely wrong reasons. And it's the same. I mean, if you look at from your perspective, I'm sure that philosophers do scandalous things with scientific objects or scientific claims, but at the same time, it's an effort to take science maybe even more seriously in some cases than it takes itself seriously.
Another question?
Yeah. To remain in the field of mathematical topology, have you been concerned with the work of René Thom?
Yes.
Structural stability.
Yes.
So it seems to be, to translate, it's so rich your presentation that I have to catch some little points I know.
Yes.
It seems to be very well in the spirit.
Yes.
Because when Thom makes his work of structural stability, he's making abstract version of really image representation.
Yes.
Greatly richer.
Yes.
So you know
Yes.
and you have quoted it.
Sorry?
You have not quoted it.
No, I mean I haven't quoted it because I tried to remain within the structure, because this is I will engage a little bit also with how then one could use René Thom for an attempt to think further the problems of classical structuralism. But for now, I mean, I would stick, for instance, with Bourbaki, who.
But for a scientist, I would say, who is not so familiar with philosophy, you can get very, very strong. Really make you put your hands in
Yes, exactly. And of course, I'm aware that the problem of instability in classical structuralism can only be, amplified, so to speak, from the perspective of development, such as netons, which are subsequent but in a way, I mean, my thesis would be it's already there in the classics. And it's really the media image of structuralism that we have to do away with in order to envisage that structuralism has been a science of instabilities or language as the major instability for which not even natural sciences, or maybe even particularly natural sciences, can claim that they are not concerned with, as in a way, all the problems of the relation between formal language and natural language, and the mobilization of the autonomy of language, of the deep psychologized language. And this is what grounds scientificity in modernity. And in this respect, disciplines or sciences like linguistics, psychoanalysis are on the same level as mathematics, as physics, in a way. I mean, there is an argument that we make.
Yes? Another question?
Yeah. So I wonder if you can name some practices or resources that you think that open up a space for language in making, which would be for me a lived language or body, not embodied but body, as like a body in its own movement.
Language is body.
Yes, of course, but I mean practices that would, for example, explore like the language as explore this dimension of unrepresentability or immeasurability or unrestability of the language and its way of thinking us, language thinking us.
I mean, psychoanalysis is a discipline or a science, if you want, or an anti-science. I mean, there is a debate about the scientific status of psychoanalysis, but let's leave that aside. But this is precisely a science that made an object out of precisely this turbulences, disturbances that speech generates in the body, and the corporality of language, which is not, I mean, which is not going in the direction of, for instance, positivist approaches like neurolinguistics, but still focuses on the connections and short circuits on the level of meaning and on symbolizations. What does a word mean to me, and what pain the image is gone, what pain it causes when it starts to influence my mode of thought and my mode of behavior and so on. So that's already one huge Lacan said the unconscious is structured like a language. In a way, he made a scandalous move away from a certain positivism which started to take hold in psi professions, whether psychoanalysis or others, and also quite a drastic move away from the symbiosis between psychotherapies or psychologies or psychoanalysis and liberalism, which is the official ideology that we all breathe in our free but very unstable markets. So it's also a very critical moment in this focus that is at stake, and that interests me quite a lot.
Just last question.
Yeah.
You spoke about the inscription in the wheel of the language. And this structure of the language, it has been shown that it has something to do with the analogy. Because we are thinking by analogies, by images, and the fold is a very good demonstration of that, because it makes us think. So there are also lots of relationship between these different images and analogy. So I was thinking that at the same time in the history of the structuralism, there was a lot of work on the complexity.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't know if you know Louis-José Lestoka works, but he had worked a lot on the complexity because this specific structure of complexity give rise to very specific movements or events like non-linearity and instabilities and very drastic systems. So he said also that the fact that our psyche is working in that way, with complexity, give rise to some structure which is specific to complexity. Do you see that kind of?
It goes precisely in the direction, you know, of just as the first reaction of what I think Deleuze and Guattari, you know, with whom I began, or also Lacan were striving to achieve with this attack on, let's say, sound reason or Aristotelian logic or analytic philosophy, which is basically touching only a very thin and superficial structuration of thought or processes of thought. So in a way moving into direction of like psychoanalysis did, for instance, the question of retroactivity is perfectly within this framework, or the construction of a weak logic, as Lacan called it, with the idea that you construct a logical system which is disclosed and which in a way is supplemented with another logical system without closing it, without producing a closure. This is basically the movement that I think structuralism has been engaged with, and also many materialist or dialectical philosophies. So in a way, what would be my interest is precisely to pursue this connection.
Thank you very much.
Thank you for allowing me to torture you.